Okay, let's talk a little bit about the historical context of Christian ethics. And the reason that we want to do this is I want to look at kind of the trajectory of history and the conversation about ethics in order to understand the questions that we're facing today when we talk about ethics, when we talk about morality, and we talk about moral formation. And especially as we talk about Christian ethics in the context of the broader conversation about ethics. Um, in no way is this a comprehensive view of the history of ethics. It's just skipping a rock across a lake and hitting a few of the highlights and a few of the ripples that will shape how we talk about ethics today. So, the first thing that I want to talk about, and I'll include these notes in your module so you can kind of follow along as well, or you don't have to write everything down as you're listening to this lecture. The first thing that I want to talk about is the Greek philosophers and virtue ethics. Before the Greek philosophers, in the ancient world, ethics was usually tied to one's gods and one's culture. So, in ethical terms, technical ethical terms anyway, it's tied to a particular community. So, you lived a right kind of life in order to please the gods so that the gods would bless you and would not curse you. So, in the ancient world, the ethics and morality was very communally based and communally focused on specific gods that were dominant in that culture, and we lived our lives, or human beings lived their lives in relationship to what pleased those gods, so that those gods would bless us. When Plato and Aristotle come around and the Greeks come around, they talk about a good that exists outside of culture. For Plato, that good is anchored in the forms. Uh, the forms and ideas exist somewhere out there, and our job as human beings is to approximate the forms of the good in our individual and our public virtue. For Plato, justice is a balance and harmony between extremes. So for individuals, harmony is governed by reason. So for Plato, the rational basis for individuals, that's what helps to define our morality and our ethics. In the public life, harmony is maintained by the wise philosophers, rulers. That is the elite class in Greco Roman culture. So they basically got to define what justice was and what this balance and harmony would be. For Aristotle, he was a little different than Plato. Reason is not abstract like Plato was. It isn't anchored in theory and ideas, but it's anchored and grounded in particular objects. So, our ultimate good for Aristotle was human happiness. And virtue for Aristotle was a state of character when the will and the reason work together to accomplish human happiness. It is a mean between Virtue is a mean between two vices or two extremes, much like Plato, where he talks about harmony. Aristotle is going to talk about human happiness. And the goal in Greek ethics was to cultivate the kind of character necessary to govern your passion and your reason according to virtue. So with Aristotle and Plato, you begin to have an external framework for ethics. There is an ethics out there that we need to discover either through rationality for Plato or for Aristotle in particularity. So Aristotle will say something like you do experiments and inference, and you will find what principles work the best, what principles develop human happiness, and those become your first principles. And then your first principles will you can build on those first principles into your secondary principles. Later on in the 11th century, Aquinas picks this up and he kind of baptizes Aristotle into Christian service. So he will talk about your telos is being set by God. So it's not necessarily human happiness, but pleasing God. And then you practice the spiritual disciplines, and that will take you beyond the classical Greek virtues. So you have the classical Greek virtues, and they will help human beings become virtuous and help them towards human happiness. But those are superseded by the Christian virtues, especially the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love, and that can get you to Christian virtue, which the Aristotelian virtues could never get you to. Okay, let's back up a little bit. So Aquinas baptizes Aristotle. Augustine baptizes Plato. And kind of the Neoplatonism that was in the 3rd and 4th century, that Augustine is relating to. So what Augustine will say is reason needs divine guidance in order to address the moral evils in this world. And then where there is no true religion, then the virtues cannot be developed. So only God alone can produce the virtues in you necessary to love him and to love your neighbor as yourself. So if you fast forward a little bit into the Reformation, we still have an ethics in the external frame, right? But what you get with the Reformation, with all the good things that you get, the solas of the Reformation, especially sola scriptura, with all the beautiful things that you get with the Reformation, you also get an inherited wedding of Christianity with the nation state. So when you take the authority of Scripture alone, outside of the Catholic Church, and place it in individuals, right? Then you get conflicts over interpretation. And there's no external authority to settle those conflicts, like the Pope or the cardinals or ecumenical councils or things like that. And so you get conflict. And sometimes you get national conflict between, say, Catholics and Protestants. So in France, the 30 Years' War devastates France and devastates Europe in such a way that people begin to look outside of the theological external frame for a grounding of their rationality and ethics. So modernity and the Enlightenment thinkers, starting in 1500s and working its way all the way to 1945, are searching for ways to think about ethics and to think about morality that avoids this kind of conflict, the conflict over interpretations of Scripture. And an interesting book that kind of highlights this conflict is Mark Noll's book called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. And so he writes about the conflict over interpretations about slavery between the North and the South, and that we couldn't solve that conflict in the United States, and so we had to go to war to solve that conflict. And that same idea was happening in Europe during the modern and Enlightenment period. So the leading thinkers of the day, many of them Christians, were trying to anchor ethics and morality not in theology but in human nature.